All right. Hello, everyone. According to its own website, the United Nations was created in 1945 following the devastation of the Second World War with one central mission, the maintenance of international peace and security. And Kofi Annan, who was its Secretary General during the pivotal decade of 1997 to 2006, according to tonight's speaker, was the most transformational leader the body has ever had. That was a very different time, wasn't it? Of globalization and the end of the Cold War and the emergence of the so-called unipolar moment. So now at our time, a contested time, a time of bitter anniversary and extreme conflict on multiple continents, what is the legacy we see today of this historic leader, Kofi Annan, and what is the significance of the organization that he led today and going forward? So those easy questions and some others will be approached by tonight's speaker, I'm happy to say. Welcome to tonight's Chat and Chowder program. My name is Mary Eintema. I'm the president of World Boston, and we're delighted that you're joining us, whether in the room or on the Zoom. We have a lot of people who reserved tonight. We were sold out, and unfortunately, they're not with us. And that's really too bad because it's such a privilege to be here. So we're so glad that you are. Before we get started, some reminders. As you may know, the mission of World Boston is to foster international engagement and global cooperation. And we thank you for being part of it. Right away, of course, we thank our gracious hosts here at Foley Lardner for sharing this beautiful venue. And I want to thank my colleague, Harrison Zyberg, our manager of global engagement programs, along with our other great World Boston colleagues. And shout out to special visitor, John Alaska, who's visiting us from the World Affairs Councils of America in DC. So council staff and World Boston board members, raise your hands. Wonderful people. And everyone else, come and talk to us later. Of course, we thank the Lowell Institute, which supports our Chat and Chowder and Great Decisions series, as well as our State Department program. The Lowell Institute makes it possible for these events to be free for all attendees. But free of charge does not mean free of cost. These programs take a lot of resources. Supporting World Boston at $25 and above, again, the QR code is one way to do that, does many things, including get you this very beautiful pin, as well as entry into our circle of 2024 community supporters. Shout out to the community supporters who are here tonight, including Nancy Nussmeyer, who recently became a community supporter and a World Boston sponsor. You can make a tax-deductible contribution to World Boston at any time and frequently on our website. Or how about now, grab one of these QR codes and think about what you would normally spend on a bowl of soup. Next, upcoming events. October 30th, big deal at the Federal Reserve Building with one of the greatest views in Boston is our landmark annual 15th Consuls Reception. It's our celebration of the Consular Corps serving our region and also of our mission and supporters. This year will feature keynote remarks by Paul Celian, Executive Vice President and Head of the Global Finance Division at State Street. Get your tickets right now. Don't miss out. November 6th. Please join us to recover from the election the day before, or maybe it will still be going on at our next Great Decisions program at Rab Hall at Boston Public Library. We will feature Dr. Ali Banu-Azizi of Boston College on the relaxing and simple topic of Mideast realignment. Then on November 12th, we'll be hosting our next Chat and Chowder back here with Rohit Lamba of Cornell University. Really looking forward to this book, Breaking the Mold, India's Untraveled Path to Prosperity. Again, you can register and learn about all this stuff at our website. Finally, on housekeeping, when we turn to the audience Q&A, please raise your hand, and when you're called on, a colleague will come around with a mic for you. We'll try to take several questions from our Zoom audience. Please submit your questions into the Q&A box on Zoom, and our staff will try and pick up some for the room. And sorry if you see me using my phone, it's how I'm staying in touch with colleagues in the room. And now, at long last, tonight's program. We're thrilled to be joined by Dr. Abiodun Williams. For the sake of time, I'll abbreviate his bio, but please read it because it's kind of incredible. He is professor of the practice of international politics at the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy, the Tisch College of Civic Life at Tufts University. He was director of the Institute for Global Leadership at Tufts from 2017 to 22. From 2001 to 2007, Dr. Williams was Director of Strategic Planning to UN Secretaries General Kofi Annan and then Ban Ki-moon. Wow. So from 1994 to 2000, he actually served in the field in peacekeeping in North Macedonia, Haiti, Bosnia, and Herzegovina. He has had faculty appointments at the National Defense University, Georgetown, and University of Rochester. He served as chair of the Academic Council on the United Nations System and as a member of the UN Secretary General's Advisory Board on Disarmament Matters, the World Economic Forum's Global Agenda, Council on Justice, the group of senior experts of the UN's Human Rights Upfront Initiative, International Board of Directors of the United World Colleges, and Lester Pearson UWC College of Trustees. He is the recipient, not surprisingly, given all that, of several awards, including the Dr. Jean Mayer Global Citizenship Award from Tufts. And he is the author or editor of 5 books. As you can see, you're in excellent hands tonight. Please welcome Dr. Williams.
Well, thank you very much, Mary, for that really wonderful and kind introduction. And thanks to World Boston for hosting me and for organizing this event. Thanks also, special thanks to Foley Lardner for hosting the event here. And thank you very much, James. It's good to meet you. And also shout out to the World Boston staff, particularly Harrison, who's been very helpful in organizing the event and making sure that I get here. And I also want to thank all of you for coming out this evening to be here in person. It's great to have in-person events. And then, of course, to thank all those who are joining us online. I think for the first question I want to address about this book, Kofi Annan and Global Leadership at the United Nations, is perhaps an obvious one. Why did I write this book? I think the first reason is that Kofi Annan, the 7th Secretary General of the United Nations, was one of the towering global leaders of the 21st century and an internationalist icon. And he was the Secretary General who captured the global imagination. And so I wanted to really explore how Kofi Annan conceived of his role as Secretary General at a turbulent period in world affairs from 1997 to 2006. I also wanted to trace the formidable challenges that he faced and to see how he dealt with those challenges. And I thought also at a time when there is a dearth of global leadership and we look around for leaders who can actually help the world address key issues, I wanted to explore how Annan really demonstrated bold and visionary leadership and the importance of leadership in advancing peace, sustainable development, and justice. I think those were the reasons why I wanted to write the book. So who was Kofi Annan and how did he become Secretary General of the United Nations? Kofi Annan was born in Ghana in 1938. And he was the son of a provincial governor and 2 paramount chiefs. And he grew up in an environment where he developed a reverence for duty or for public service. as the son of a provincial governor and two hereditary paramount chiefs. He was educated in Ghana at a prestigious boarding school for boys called Infanzipim, which was founded by the Methodist Church in the 19th century. And he later observed that studying at Infanzipim infused in him a moral sense and the sense that suffering anywhere was a concern for people everywhere. So a sense of public service, duty, and the alleviation of human suffering were key elements in his ethical framework. And then Annan finished his undergraduate education here in the United States. He studied economics at Macalester, and then he did his graduate work in Geneva. And then later on in his career, he came to a school not far away, MIT, where he was a Sloan fellow and he studied management. Annan found his vocation very early when he joined the UN system in 1962. He was 24 as a budget officer with the World Health Organization. And he joined, and this is very interesting and significant, at the lowest level of the international civil service. And he had an experience in different agencies and different parts of the UN. He worked with the UN Refugee Agency. He worked with the UN Economic Commission for Africa. And beginning in the 1980s, he had a series of high-level positions at UN headquarters in New York, including Under-Secretary General for Peacekeeping. And so he developed an extraordinary knowledge of the workings of the United Nations system. And over that long career in the UN, he had impressed many people with his diplomatic skills, his ability to work harmoniously with people from a range of different nationalities, different backgrounds, and his problem-solving approach. So in 1996, the Clinton administration and the US ambassador to the UN, Madeleine Albright, who later became the first woman US Secretary of State, decided they were going to veto the re-election of the Egyptian Secretary General, Boutros Ghali. The Clinton administration knew that Boutros Ghali, who was the first Arab and first African Secretary General, would only be succeeded politically by another African. And as I said, Annan had impressed not only the United States, but many countries with his talents. And at that time, he was the most senior African in the United Nations system. And so in December 1996, on the recommendation of the UN Security Council, Kofi Annan was elected as the 7th Secretary General of the United Nations. He was the first Black Secretary General, the first from Sub-Saharan Africa, and the first, and so far, the only Secretary General to rise to that position through the ranks of the UN system. So he broke barriers. The other question, I think, which would be interesting to touch on is what was Kofi Annan's vision for the Secretary Generalship? The United Nations is an organization of states, 193 states. But Annan believed that the United Nations was founded in the name of we the peoples, because the charter begins, we the peoples of the United Nations. So he always stressed that even though it's an organization of states, the charter was founded in the name of we the peoples. So at the heart of Annan's vision was that you had to place people's rights and their needs at the center of the UN's action. And you have to bring the United Nations closer to the peoples of the world. The second, I think, element of the vision of Kofi Annan was that he believed that the UN's cardinal purposes, peace and security, development, human rights, were interconnected and inseparable, that you could not have development and peace without security, you could not have security without human rights. And of course, he was the first Secretary General who was a leader in human rights. And human rights, his belief that he had to become a leader in the human rights came, of course, from his own convictions, his moral convictions, and of course, the aftermath of the end of the Cold War, which created political space for Secretary General to push on human rights. The other element of Kofi Annan's vision for the Secretary Generalship was the importance of effective, inclusive multilateralism and international cooperation, because he believed that all the problems of humanity, from climate change to migration, to pandemics, to terrorism, all of these problems, which were beyond the capacity of any one country, however powerful, however strong, to solve by itself. And these problems needed effective, inclusive multilateralism and international cooperation. He was the one who coined the term problems without passports. He said, these are all problems without passports, and therefore you need blueprints without borders in order to solve them. And I think the final key element of his vision was the importance of partnerships, because Annan recognized that in an era of globalization, the United Nations could not rely solely on states, solely on interstate cooperation, solely on interstate power in order to achieve its objectives. That the United Nations needed to reach out and form partnerships with non-state actors. So he reached out to NGOs, he reached out to academia, he reached out to philanthropic organizations and foundations, and in the starkest departure from all his predecessors, he reached out to the private sector. And in fact, one of his legacies is the UN Global Compact, which is a partnership between the United Nations and business, and has grown into the largest sustainability initiative linking the UN and the private sector. So all of those were elements of the vision of Kofi Annan. Now, let me address another question and just give a sense of the role that Kofi Annan played in addressing global challenges. First, Annan was the architect of the 8 Millennium Development Goals. When he became Secretary General in 1997, he persuaded the UN General Assembly to have a Millennium Summit in 2000, because he believed that the Millennium would be a unique opportunity to bring together world leaders, to bring together the peoples of the world to try to tackle urgent global tasks. And in the lead up to the summit, he published a report called We the Peoples, again emphasizing his view about the importance of putting people at the center of what the UN does. And in that report, the Millennium Report, We the Peoples, contained 8 goals, which were later officially adopted as the Millennium Development Goals, including the goal of halving the number of people living in extreme poverty, $1 a day, providing universal primary education, dealing with HIV, AIDS, malaria. And those 8 Millennium Development Goals paved the way for the 17 Sustainable Development Goals, which we have today. So we would not have had the SDGs without Annan's leadership on the MDGs. Annan, second, also led the global fight against HIV/AIDS. When he became Secretary General, thousands of people were dying from the disease every day. And in 1999 alone, 5,000, just take one region of the world, 5,000 Africans were dying every day from HIV/AIDS. So Annan felt he had a moral duty to be in the vanguard to try to tackle HIV/AIDS. So because of his advocacy, that led to the creation of the Global Fund to fight AIDS, tuberculosis, and malaria, which he pushed. Also at this time, treatment for AIDS was extremely expensive. It cost, about 25 years ago, about $12,000 a year for treatment. And Annan used his convening power to bring together the CEOs of the leading pharmaceutical companies. It began with the first meeting in Amsterdam, and over a series of meetings, he persuaded the CEOs to make antiretroviral drugs available at affordable prices in developing countries. Again, linked to the importance of partnerships, the private sector. And there are millions of people who are alive today because Kofi Annan demonstrated robust leadership, which was driven by hope and driven by empathy. The other area, he was also very active on conflict prevention. And for Kofi Annan, he believed that he tried to move the UN from what he called a culture of reaction to a culture of prevention. It's an exceedingly difficult task, but he believed there were moral, economic, and strategic reasons for focusing on conflict prevention. One example of his role was his mediation between Cameroon and Nigeria over the disputed Bakassi Peninsula. The Bakassi Peninsula dispute did not make the international headlines, but this had been a simmering dispute between Nigeria and Cameroon. The Bakassi Peninsula rich in oil and other resources. And Annan, Cameroon had taken Nigeria to the International Court of Justice. But Annan understood and recognized that a judgment by the International Court of Justice on its own would not be sufficient to resolve this issue. So before the judgment was handed down, he engaged the presidents of Nigeria and Cameroon. And over a number of years, his patient, astute, and effective diplomacy resulted in the Green Tree Agreement in 2006, which resolved the Bakassi Peninsula. And that is another, I think, testament to the kind of leadership of Kofi Annan, because he recognized that global leadership was not only about dealing with the headline-grabbing disputes. You should also recognize disputes which are not in the headlines, but which have the potential to create international conflict. The other area of Annan's legacy is the responsibility to protect, which he called his most precious achievement. The responsibility to protect came about because of the failure of the international community and UN peacekeepers to prevent genocide in Rwanda. In 1994, 800,000 people were slaughtered, and genocide in Srebrenica in Bosnia. And it happened when Annan was Under-Secretary General for Peacekeeping. It had a profound and lasting impact on him, so that when he became Secretary General, he was determined to do something about that. And in a series of speeches, he challenged the international community. He challenged the guardians of state sovereignty, that a way had to be found to deal with genocide and mass atrocities. And at his urging, the world leaders at the 2005 World Summit adopted the responsibility to protect civilians from 4 atrocity crimes: genocide, war crimes, ethnic cleansing, and crimes against humanity. And the responsibility to protect reflects what I call in the book the Annan Doctrine, that state sovereignty cannot be used as a shield for atrocity crimes. The other thing I think I should mention area is, of course, 9/11 and Iraq. The attacks, the terrorist attacks on the United States and 9/11 happened 3 months before the end of Annan's first term as Secretary General. And Annan vociferously condemned terrorism because he believed that terrorism was the most extreme violation of human rights because it violates the most fundamental of human rights, which is the right to life. Yet at the same time, he warned presciently that you could not, in the battle against terrorism, compromise human rights. And he argued that to compromise human rights or to violate human rights in the battle against terrorism would ultimately be self-defeating. On Iraq, the Iraq War, which was launched without Security Council authorization, without hard evidence, without international legal justification, really cast a huge shadow on the United Nations. And Kofi Annan, it brought Kofi Annan into a clash with Washington, you see, because he had opposed the unilateral invasion of Iraq. And Annan, because Annan, as I have said, would not, of course, have become Secretary General without the strong support of the United States. And when he became Secretary General, this was the unipolar moment when the United States dominated world affairs. So at a time of American hegemony, it was very important to Kofi Annan to have a working relationship with the United States. So much so, his extraordinary diplomatic skills succeeded in getting the US Congress to pay its outstanding arrears to the United Nations. Because when he became Secretary General, the UN was facing bankruptcy because the Congress was withholding $1.3 billion as pressure for reform. So Annan took the challenge of reform of the UN, which he did, and then he cultivated relations in Washington from both sides and succeeded in getting the United States to pay its outstanding dues. But it was the Iraq War which brought him into conflict with the administration in Washington. I think in retrospect now, looking back, the Iraq War, which is a great tragedy, it cost thousands of lives of American service, men and women. It cost thousands of lives in Iraq, and then it led to regional instability. So Annan has a reasonable claim, I think, to prescience on Iraq. So what then, the next question, what were the most significant reforms that Kofi Annan made to the UN? Well, the first, I think, is his legacy with the peace-building architecture, which comprises the Peace-Building Commission, the Peace-Building Support Office, and the Peace-Building Fund. Because Annan recognized that there's a huge gap in the machinery of the UN. Peacekeepers are deployed, and then they leave, and invariably in about 5 years or so, countries relapse into conflict. And so he persuaded the General Assembly and the Security Council to establish the peace-building architecture. Second, because of his strong commitment to human rights, he recognized and believed that the framers of the UN had left a gap because they'd established the Security Council, which deals with peace and security. They had established the Economic and Social Council, which deals with development and economic issues. But there was no Council for Human Rights, which he believes is such a critical at the very heart of the UN's mission. And the Human Rights Commission, which had been established in the 40s, had become totally discredited. So he pushed and persuaded the General Assembly and the Security Council to establish the Human Rights Council. And then in terms of some of the enduring changes to the UN and how it works, any serious government has a cabinet. The UN had never had a cabinet before Kofi Annan, and he established the senior management group, which would brings together the heads of the department to make sure this huge organization could at least work in a more effective and coherent way. And then when he became Secretary General, he thought, this is a very demanding job, but there is no Deputy Secretary General. He was the first Secretary General to say, I need a deputy. That takes courage. We know deputies are not always, we know from vice presidents, the relationship between a vice president and a president can be quite challenging. Kofi said, we need a Deputy Secretary General in this organization. And it was at his urging that the General Assembly approved his recommendation. So let me just now touch quickly on two final questions. The first is, how did Kofi Annan exercise leadership? What were the tools that he used? The first thing is the unique job of Secretary General is like none other. The Secretary General has no political power in the conventional sense. The Secretary General has no armies. The Secretary General commands no territory. The Secretary General imposes no taxes. What the Secretary General does have is a soft power and moral authority. And Annan used the moral authority of the Secretary Generalship, which was a valuable resource that can have a significant impact on events. The second tool is what I call in the book, I call him the Communicator General. There's a section, the Communicator General and the Bully Pulpit. So Annan could talk to global publics. He could use the bully pulpit to exhort, to inspire, to persuade, and to raise issues, to touch on critical global issues. And he could also use it effectively to resist the power of powerful member states. So he exercised soft power from a global platform. The other key tool is something I've mentioned when I talked about his convening of the CEOs of pharmaceutical companies. It was his convening power. The ability to bring in key actors, key people, key organizations to deal with global tasks. And then finally, of course, the tool, of course, of partnerships, bringing together different actors to solve problems. So finally, for final question, what were the qualities that made Kofi Annan the most transformational Secretary General, and in my view, the most influential and significant Secretary General in the UN's history? Well, he had a vast knowledge of the UN system, unrivaled by any Secretary General. He also had exceptional diplomatic skills. He was a consensus builder. He had astute judgment. He was perceptive. And he was unflappable. It didn't matter what the crisis was. It was always unflappable. And he had the courage of his convictions and the ability to wrap up a very tough message in soft phrases. And he had also personal attributes. He had empathy. He was courteous. And he was an optimist. It didn't matter how dismal the situation was. He never lost his optimism. And I think he had farsightedness. He had integrity and moral rectitude. And he recognized that realism about the UN's deficiencies does not entail fatalism about the opportunities it presents. And he's left, I think, an impressive legacy for our times and for future generations.
Am I on? I am on. All right. So we have time for a few questions. I see lots of new faces, which is great, but we'll point out to new and old that questions at World Boston end with a question mark. And let's raise your hands and we'll try and get a sense around the room and someone will come up to you. We'll start with James, our host. Matt, you can, or Miranda, I'll bring you the mic.
All right, Dr. Williams, thank you very much. What would Kofi Annan think about the state of the United Nations today?
Well, I think he would recognize that the UN is facing enormous challenges. He would recognize, of course, that the Security Council, which is so central to the maintenance of international peace and security, is unable to address key security issues because it is blocked and deadlocked, and deadlocked. So that would be of great concern to him. But I think he would also look at other parts of the UN system. He would see that that organ has good challenges, but he would look at other parts of the UN system. He would see what the UN is doing in terms of humanitarian assistance. He would look at the contribution that the World Health Organization is made and is making in terms of pandemics. He would urge us to say, well, let's look at what the UN is doing to help millions of refugees around the world. And let us also think that even though UN peacekeeping has been facing challenges, it is helping nations who are facing difficult peace and security issues, the peacekeepers. So he would recognize the challenges and the problems, would be working hard to deal with them, but be looking also, because he was a realist and he always saw the glass as half full, not half empty, at the other parts of the system, which are actually making huge contributions.
Okay, thank you. Yep, Ed, go right ahead, Matt, or sorry, Miranda. And then I'm going to be looking for any students or first timers.
Again, thank you for your talk today. I'd like to go back to a little bit about his working on reform. How much did he do? One of the many complaints of the UN is its sort of its fundamental governance. The Security Council comes to mind. How much did he work on that and try to get that changed? I think since World War II is over, we might want to change the Security Council a little bit.
Yes,
thank you.
This was an issue which was of great concern to him, because the Security Council, of course, reflects the political and economic realities of 1945. And Annan believed that reform of the UN would never be complete without reform of the Security Council. So in the last wave of reforms in 2005, and I discussed this in the book, he put forward proposals, two key proposals to reform the UN Security Council, to make it more representative of the world of the 21st century, to make it more legitimate in the 21st century. But that was not successful. He got other successes, the Peace Building Commission, the Human Rights Council, but the member states could not agree on the Security Council reform. It is a difficult issue, but although it is difficult, I think ultimately it's one of those issues that the UN has to grapple with and find a solution to Security Council reform.
Great, thank you. I think we had a question right here, and somebody had requested it's up to you, but if you want to identify yourself, great. If you don't, just ask your question. Anyway, go ahead.
Hello, my name is Rohan. Thank you, Doctor, for your remarks. If I understood correctly, you mentioned that perhaps one of Secretary General Annan's convictions was to include "we the peoples" in the charter for the UN. And that to me seems like it is an implication of everyone has a stakeholder, everyone has a stake in the UN. So my question would be, given your analysis of Kofi Annan, what expectations do you believe he would articulate from we the peoples as lay individuals, as lay citizens who may not have, UN access?
Right. Interesting.
Well, yes, absolutely. As I said, he believed very much that the UN had to be brought close to the people. So he would look at the role that individuals can make within their communities at the local level, in getting involved, as we're seeing, on issues like climate change, for example, environmental issues, in dealing with issues such as pandemics. He also tried, even with the resistance from certain member states, to bring civil society more into the work of the UN, so that you could have civil society input into hearings by the UN, into summits which the UN was organizing to get the ideas of peoples, of groups, so that that could be really reflected. And in his view, that was absolutely, if you were going to get solutions, you certainly could not just rely on governments and states, important though they are.
Great, thank you. We'll go to Val right here. You're going to get a mic in a second.
Thank you very much for this, very good presentation. Where do you think that Kofi Annan fell short? I mean, obviously there are things that he could not avoid: the NATO bombing of Serbia, the U.S. Invasion of Afghanistan, and then Iraq, and so on and so forth. But in particular, there's been a lot of criticism of his privatization of the UN, bringing the private sector in. That's become very, very controversial. So where do you see his defects and where did he fall short? Thank you.
Well, on the privatization, as you put it, the UN, my sense is that it was more controversial when he did it than it is now. Because when Kofi Annan reached out, as I said, in the starkest departure from the private to the private sector, this was considered heresy by many who thought, why should you be talking to the private sector? This is not something a Secretary General does. But he recognized that in the 21st century, the private sector and other actors can have expertise, which the UN does not have. He was a classic insider, but he recognized that knowledge did not just reside within the UN. He was always looking outside. So the private sector could have expertise. It could certainly have resources to help the UN in its development work, and also in dealing with pandemics. He also recognized that you needed champions and advocates for the UN, not just states. So, and I think now the private sector is involved to a much greater degree. And there's a much more acceptance of the role of the private sector in the role in the work of the UN because of all these formidable challenges which we face. So that's my sense. In terms of some of the difficulties that Annan faced, I think one of the difficulties, of course, was in the area of the Security Council reform, because the Secretary General proposes, but it is the member states who dispose. So a Secretary General could propose, as he did, key sensible proposals for Security Council reform, but the member states decided for one reason or another, whether it's regional rivalry and national rivalries, that this was not going to happen. So he wasn't able to get that. So I think on the areas where he was unable to succeed, for example, giving more authority to the Secretary General to actually run the place. Most people are shocked when they realize that the Secretary General has less authority to run the organization in terms of personnel than a CEO of a mid-sized company. Because what you've had over several decades is encroachment on the authority of the Secretary General as a chief administrative officer. So in trying to get greater authority, that did not always succeed.
Okay, we're going to wrap up with a very easy question from Zoom. Viewer on Zoom. How do you think Kofi Annan would approach de-escalating the war in Ukraine?
Very easy question for the Zoom on Zoom. Well, I think what I would say is that Kofi Annan believed fundamentally that armed conflict, war, was not inevitable. That war, any war, is caused by human beings and can be stopped by human beings. The second belief was that conflict prevention is critical, and it is important at all three phases of a conflict cycle. So preventing the initial outbreak, preventing continuation and escalation, and then preventing recurrence. So at the heart, of course, of in terms of Ukraine, he would be trying to use his good offices to work with the key players to try to bring about de-escalation and to find a solution to this problem. The Security Council, of course, is key because there's a permanent member of the Security Council involved in Ukraine. And so for Annan and for any Secretary General to be able to play a role as a mediator, a role in terms of preventing or de-escalating any conflict, you have to be able, like Annan, to have won the confidence of the Security Council. And not only to have won the confidence of the Security Council, to have won the trust of the key members of the Security Council, as well as the broader membership. And he would be using that trust, which he had gained and won with the Security Council and the broader membership, to try to find a way out of the crisis. But it doesn't matter what the crisis was, he never gave in to a sense of helplessness. And for Kofi Annan, however dismal and awful a situation might look, you could still find a way using human ability and working with the players to find a solution to conflict.
Okay, so I want to make sure that we have time for buying books and networking. So for the moment, please join me in thanking Dr. Abiodun Williams.